Hello there, welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. We're going into the depths of early cinema, or at least the early stages of a particular genre today. I thought, we are now well into October and still loosely covering the horror theme sort of every couple of days. I thought it would be quite fun to look at an early example of the genre as it was being sort of formulated and structured. And this film has sort of been floating around for some time, sort of in the back of my head, and I thought it was worth finally watching 1942's Cat People. As I say, this is the formulation of the genre. This is in a period where, yes, we had Dracula, we had Frankenstein, we had Nosferatu, we might even have had The Mummy, if I remember rightly. You know, the early 30s and 40s was not a period where horror had not come into, wasn't in existence. But it was a period where genre conventions were still being decided, and particularly with sub-genres. Frankenstein, Dracula, of course, are novel adaptations, and therefore the structure, the plot beats, the tension moments, they had already been outlined, within the literary idea or representation of it, and it just simply was a case of recreating that for screen. But in respect of deciding what made good horror originally, when you're looking at a scene, at the construction of story, trying to work out, okay, how do we make this particular story horrific? How do we make this particular sequence horrific? How do we, create interesting and compelling characters without falling into sort of more melodramatic conventions, or creating scenarios where things are supposedly horrific and yet come across as quite mundane. And I think Cat People is a good example of sort of an early experimentation with that and going, how do we work this out? I also think that it's a good example of the genesis of the psychosexual thriller. It had existed before, don't get me wrong. Like with horror, it had existed within novels for decades, hence. And Hitchcock had even flirted with the idea in films that he had been making in the 30s and 40s. But to have such an overtly, to say overtly sexual is possibly laying it on a bit thick, but to have a film that is about sex and sexuality in the text of the narrative would have been quite original for that time period. The fact that the film was allowed to be made is, because of course we were in that strange period where in the US the Hays Code hadn't come into force, but there was still an expectation of what was allowed and not allowed to be made within Hollywood cinema. Informally, I suppose, if you look at the 30s, there were periods where, without a particular code, and if you look at European cinema, there were some sort of boundary pushing filmmaking, but even then Hollywood was starting to guideline exactly what they were expecting in terms of decency, you might say. And so the idea that Cat People was permitted to be made, the idea of this, like I say, overtly sexual narrative about female sexuality and the idea of acting upon it and the consequences of it and the sort of subtext, it's a remarkable document of the time and the ways in which in the 1940s they were dealing with sort of psychology and sexuality and how the conversation around those topics was presented. I mean, the fact that there are, in some ways, as someone who was nearly 100 years beyond the point of the making of this film, there are certain ways that I would admire how the film handles itself. because, like so many from now, we look back at a certain point in history and assume that ideas about psychology, trauma, sexuality, these things, weren't particularly handled well in the first half of the 20th century. We assume that, yes, we had Freud and Jung and schools of thought, but broadly speaking, people just didn't discuss it. And when it was discussed, there were these horrible, broad ideas. And so the fact that this film at least makes an attempt at discussing these ideas, even though the psychologist character is troublesome at best, and some of the things that he suggests to the female characters is definitely dated, you still get the sense that they are you have to admire the fact that they are talking about the sexual psychology of it. And yeah, like I say, it is an interesting document of the time. As a narrative, I'm not sure. I really am not, because this is not a long film by any stretch. It's 70 minutes, and yet it feels like such a long film, because very little really happens in it, and very little happens over quite a quick amount of time, because it follows Irena, who is this Serbian immigrant who's quite private, and then she meets a man named Oliver Reed. Yes, the irony is not lost on me. But Oliver Reed is, very much your all-American, sort of typical 1940s man. And he courts Irena, falls in love with her, marries her. And the fact that in the film we see their first meeting, we see their courtship, and we see them get married very quickly in this film. Within the first half hour of this film, that's all happened. And then, of course, it's about the fact that because of an ancient cultural curse, she is unable to act upon her desires because it will turn her into a cat person. It will turn her into a panther, broadly speaking. And yeah, but once you sort of barrel through their relationship, establish the key players, which is him and her, his female friend who's also in love with him, and the psychologist who is trying to help Irena get over her issue. And there are a couple of characters who are dotted around, sort of just on the periphery of those. Again, you establish those characters fairly quickly, and then it's just about this central theme, and it lingers on it so intensely, and yet isn't able to move it forwards, because it's about the fact that Irena can't act upon her desires, and yet wants to, and is struggling with it, and Oliver doesn't understand. And again, it's just sort of a vast majority of this film is just that central struggle, and it becomes very difficult to watch because it can't move forward, and yet the tension is about it trying to push forward. And so consequently, it's not a badly acted or made film. It's just, I don't know, it's interesting because, as I say, as a document of the time, as a film that's exploring ideas that, of course, we then would make huge themes within storytelling going forward in respect of presentation of horror, in sort of themes of sexuality, in intense character dramas. It's all there, but it's in its very early infancy. And yeah, it is interesting to see this sort of proto-horror film, because it's not really a horror. There are 3 moments that one would say are the sort of more definitive horror moments, which is Alice, the friend of Oliver's, being pursued whilst walking then the swimming pool scene with Alice, and then the murder of Dr. Judd. And those are it, really. And they're very short scenes. And they're more like suspense thriller scenes than they are active horror scenes, other than the supernatural aspect of them. Particularly the pursuing scene. Other than the fact that we know there is this sort of cat monster aspect to it, it could be just as easily a sequence that exists within a thriller. And I think ultimately that's sort of the nature of it, that it is more a thriller than it is a horror, because it's more about the psychological and it's more about the jealousies and tensions and sort of the psychology of characters and their desires and their actions. So of course you have that sort of love triangle thing between Irena, Oliver and Alice, the fact that the both women are in love with him, the fact that one is about to steal him from the other. You also have Dr. Judd, who I just kept watching thinking, creep, real creep, particularly towards Irena. And, you know, in that respect, it plays like a thriller. If the story had been that rather than turning into a cat person, she was just a serial killer, the beats would have worked probably the same, you know, in a very Hitchcockian sense. Like I say, the supernatural aspect just adds that little extra something. And it is unusual, particularly for that time. And again, the fact that they go to the effort to have this sort of cat monster, and even though we don't see it, the implication of it is a cool one. It's an interesting idea, but again, it's all about execution. And I think it's definitely strange to see a horror of that age, and the fact that it doesn't quite know how to be yet. It doesn't know how to construct horror scenes. It hasn't quite worked out the mise en scène of the horror. There are moments when it really does, particularly around Simone Simon's performance, where she really plays this damaged character who's haunted, and you think, oh yes, I can see a few years later you could see that kind of performance working really well. But then there are other moments where it plays more like a traditional romance film, and other moments where it almost, to say comedy is possibly being a little unkind, but the relationships between characters almost is so light-hearted that when you have these more intense psychological moments, it just doesn't quite hold together as well as it should. But yeah, it's an interesting one, because I like the idea of seeing early cinema experimentation and genre formulation, and the idea of, okay, they haven't worked out what this is, but they're trying things, they're testing things to see what works and how to sort of bring together narratives to create what we understand as, you know, genre now. And therefore that's at least made it worth the time anyway. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because it's all helping the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 250 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me.